Good afternoon. I've decided that maybe at FAMU we should start having classes on Saturday because I've never seen so many people in school. But I'm very happy that you're here, and I'm very happy on behalf of FAMU and behalf of MIDPOINT that we have this collaboration with the Mezipatra Film Festival, which has organized today's special guests. And I would like to invite and welcome the director of the film festival, Mr. Drapal, Alice Drapal. Welcome to FAMU, and please present our guests.
Thank you so much. Thank you for FAMU and for MIDPOINT for organizing this masterclass with us. And I'm very excited that Mr. Todd Haynes found time to come to the festival, and he will be presenting his feature films. So after the masterclass, you will have the opportunity to see Save, Far From Heaven, and also Poison on the big screen at the festival cinemas. So do take the opportunity. I'd like to welcome Boyd Van Hoeij, who will be the host of this masterclass, and Mr. Todd Haynes. Thank you very much for coming.
That's better. Well, before we start looking at some clips, I think one of the main themes that we see, recurring theme in your work, is desire. So, obvious first question would be, where did your desire for filmmaking come from? When did that start? When did that start following in your, start forming in your mind?
I think. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a great turnout on a beautiful Saturday in your amazing city. Desire. I think desire was born when I saw my very first film as a 3-year-old person, which was Mary Poppins in 1964. And it had a kind of seismic effect on my young mind. And of course, it was a time when kids didn't have DVDs to play over and over again at home. But something about that experience in the theater, watching the cinematic, experience take one over, was so powerful, so profound, that it induced a kind of obsessive cycle of desire around that first film that sort of permeated me, and that created this kind of creative compulsion, so that I guess I just would want to recreate it in some way through drawings, paintings, plays, reenactments, dressing up my mother as Mary Poppins over and over again, in this obsessive compulsive relationship to that original moment on the big screen. I can't think of any more singular event that propelled that desire into orbit.
Let's talk a little bit about your very first works, Assassins, and also Superstar, the Carpenter Story.
Yes.
Which, if you want, we're going to screen later after this. So if you want to stay on, we actually have a copy of that, so you'll be able to see that. Can you talk a little bit about how these things came about? What your sort of idea was? As you said, I think when you're very young, very quickly what you start doing is, if you like something, you start copying something. But obviously there's a point where you start, injecting your own ideas into that. Mm-hmm. So in the very beginning, how did that process work for you when you started actually making those first films?
Assassins, the first film you mentioned, was a thesis project in college. I went to Brown University in the East Coast of the United States, and I studied film theory, and it was a unique program at the time in the early 80s that was basically called the semiotics program within the English department. It was not even a fully fledged department. It was an annex of the English department, and occupied a kind of renegade status vis-a-vis the rest of the academy at Brown. And but before one could make a film, one was exposed to theories of narrativity and semiotic theory and psychoanalytic theory and all of these various languages that found a kind of way of interpreting the artistic experience. And I think, you know, for me, those languages were relevant. They became a sort of expression or externalization of questions I already had been harboring, I think, about my own relationship to masculinity, to sexuality, to identity. And film occupied a unique, pivotal core of those questions. And I think I found that it in some ways, for some people, I think it was an impediment to pure creative work, the theoretical discourses. And I think for me, they were inspirational, and they helped me find perhaps more disciplined ways of mediating my own ambivalence toward narrative, I think. And so Assassins, which is called Assassins, a film concerning Rimbaud, was my own sort of way of entering into the tradition of you know, artists' work on Rimbaud. When you go to look at Rimbaud's work in the library, there's this much original writing, and then there's aisles and aisles of work about Rimbaud, and a kind of intense desire on the part of so many different artists to find their way into the Rimbaud effect and find a sort of identification with Rimbaud, and in many ways navigate an intense desire for Rimbaud. And I felt that the film is less a kind of story of Rimbaud and Verlaine as it is a story of our desire for Rimbaud. And so it draws from a lot of secondary sources and interpretive voices, and it's layered with that kind of you know, experimental sort of style of layering information about a subject. And in many ways, I think the character one identifies most closely with in Assassins is Verlaine, who was himself an artist, a poet, and who got about as close as you could get to Rimbaud and still not penetrate the Rimbaud thing, you know? And that frustration, which also produces more desire because you can't enter the fire of Rimbaud, was part of the subject of that film and part of the cultural literary legacy of Rimbaud himself. So that's sort of what that project was about. And of course, the sexual life of those characters and the sort of almost the gossip, the rumors, the projections that circulate and, you know, almost fetishistically around Rimbaud, and the stories of Rimbaud and Verlaine were very much the content of that film. And then I graduated, and then I moved to New York, and it was around that time. This is like, I graduated in 1985, and I came to the city and started to think about doing another film. And I wanted to work with a good friend of mine, Cynthia Schneider, sort of one of my best friends out of college. And she wasn't really a filmmaker per se. She was an artist and studied law, and which became useful later in the legacy of Superstar. And we said, okay, we want to make a movie. And I think I was already thinking I wanted to apply aspects of narrative theory to a film and play out some hypotheses about the narrative effect on audiences. And the one thing we agreed on, she was like, let's do a film with just using pets And I said, no, let's do a film just using dolls. And we were like, oh, no, pets, no, dolls, no, pets. Later I would do a sort of art project with Christine Vachon where we did use domestic pets as the subject, called Domestic Violence. And then I was sitting in some cafe in New York, and this was probably 86 at this point, and there was a Light FM radio station playing. And this was before there was all these retro 70s revival dance parties and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, this was like 86,
This was
87?
86, probably at this point. And I heard, and Karen Carpenter had only died in 1983, so it was still fairly recent. And I heard one of those Carpenter songs. Every sha-na-na-na, every whoa-whoa-whoa. And I was stunned. I was completely, I was catapulted out of myself hearing it, because it did so many things, that song. It reminded me of my own childhood and the sort of last moment that I think I shared popular culture with my parents, where we all loved the Carpenters together. And from that point on, we would all diverge into very different directions in our pop cultural tastes. But this was a moment where that coalesced. But everything that had happened since 1970 to the country, the cynicism that marked the 1970s and Watergate years, and all of those political themes, paranoia and alienation and questioning of power and a mistrust of provided images of American cohesion and happiness, which were always available, but I think at a more popular and massive level, they were beginning to be questioned during that decade. And then what happened to Karen Carpenter herself, where we learned that this girl who kind of almost, insidiously and probably falsely projected a kind of pseudo-depth into these pop constructions that seemed so superficial, so manipulative, given what actually happened to her and the insight that it exposed after the fact into her own struggles with her body, with her sense of self, with her femininity. All of a sudden, those songs gained a kind of depth that they never seemed to have the first time around.
Yeah, like a dimension behind the facade.
Exactly. And all of a sudden, they felt incredibly moving and sad. They still felt manipulative. They still made you cringe and maybe laugh. But there was a reservoir of depth that they hadn't really provided, at least me, until then. And I thought, oh my God, it has to be. I said, Cynthia, we have to do the Karen Carpenter story. She was like, okay, we'll use dolls. And that was pretty much how we embarked on the project. And I think, I pretty much wrote the script, but she was very much the discourse around anorexia that kind of weaves through Superstar. Superstar sort of takes the star story genre, the rise and fall of the pop star, and in a very sincere, sympathetic, and committed way, it replicates those narrative conventions, but just does it in miniature. And I felt pretty certain that by doing so, an audience would find themselves getting caught up in the emotional connections that we all feel in traditional narrative experience, but it would be done with dolls. And at some point, you'd have to step back and observe your own emotional connection to that film, realizing it's constructed, but that construction would not necessarily destroy the emotional connection that you have. So you would have both sides of it, I guess, in the classic Brechtian model. But we also wanted to sort of intersperse it with questionable popular discourse around anorexia. And that was something that Cynthia was particularly helpful in putting together. And the experience of making that film ultimately with Cynthia, my boyfriend at the time, Bob Menenti, my very dear friend Barry Ellsworth from college, really the three of us in a room constructing all of those shots, you know, building the dolls. Like, it was almost like having an assembly line of body parts. We had heads all lined up on a shelf. We had torsos all lined up on a shelf. We had clothes from the late 60s, clothes from the early 70s, clothes from the late 70s, all lined up on a shelf. And you just plugged your extras together and voila, you had your cast. You know, it was an amazing, it was the ultimate studio system in miniature. And we used a animation crank, just a simple calibrated track that we put the 16mm camera onto and could crank it while shooting live action. It's not an animated film, Superstar. It's done like with puppets, with hidden sticks and strings and so forth. And we recorded all of the dialogue in advance, so we puppet acted the act dolls to the pre-recorded dialogue. But we could do these cool tracking shots in or out of a scene or across a lateral track across a set. In a way, I think that experience remains my most purely pleasurable, where we were really in control of every aspect of the production in this miniature soundstage.
No cranky actors, yeah.
No cranky no, only a cranky crank.
So would you say in these first medium length features, were you very much? I mean, were they the embodiment of themes and aesthetics that were already clear for you, or was there a big part of it where you were discovering what was really important for you while you were making the film?
I think there were certain motives for certainly with Rimbaud. Like I said, it was sort of navigating one's own sort of cultural crush on a famous literary subject. With Superstar, it was a little different because it was more about redeeming the sort of denigrated reputation and the sort of easy dismissal of Karen Carpenter as a cultural object, and really, in many ways, redeeming her in relationship to her own family environment. The family environment being the most poisonous circumstance that induces anorexic behavior. And this family story is a classic case in which the pressures and the striving for perfection and the limited places where one can fail safely are accelerated because of their fame and because of the rigidity, I think.
They're magnified.
Magnified. And the kind of coldness, I think, of the parental situation as well. So we felt we were kind of, you know, revering Karen and almost saving her from her own, you know, life story. Sadly enough, as the film, you know, was completed and finished, and we knew we were hitting legal problems when we obviously had no rights to any of the music when the film was completed. But I had no idea that the film would take off and become discussed in, you know, film press and sort of induced sort of cult following the way it did. And in many ways, Karen's body was still being controlled by the family in the ways in which they were able to suppress the film in its release in the end. And that felt like a sad, ironic culmination of the experience.
Yeah, I think in a way, I mean, for this film, it almost feels appropriate, you know?
Yeah,
that this
I mean, it does, yeah. I hope at some level, since the film is still something that people talk about among my work as readily as almost anything else I've made, with real actors and some very great actors and larger attention down the line, that in many ways we might have surpassed some of the restrictions and controls that the Carpenter family and the brother in particular maintained.
So is there any hope that will these rights ever become available or go into the public domain?
No, not in terms of music rights.
No.
There's no real statute of limitations.
Right.
There's a statute of limitations that, like with Cocksucker Blues, I think it gets is annually reinstated. So I think that film finally had a settlement that it could be shown once a year. The statute of limitations would kick back in, and then they'd be reintroduced when the film would be shown again each year. So it was sort of on an annual basis that the film had a freedom of visibility. But I mean, it's remarkable today that any film we can think of is banned. You know, it's like, it's a hard thing to think of other examples of. And the film now is, can be seen on YouTube and stuff like that. I'm still not allowed to show it publicly for any kind of commercial, in any kind of commercial context. But it lives on.
Okay, so let's move from that. It's a 43-minute film, I think.
Yeah, 43 minutes, 47 minutes, something like that. Yeah.
From that to go to your first feature, I mean, how big a step was that? Did it feel like a big step?
It felt not too much. In that, one thing that I loved seeing when Superstar was being shown to audiences was that in the ways that we navigated, that we sort of interwove traditional narrative references to experimental film traditions and sort of a interspersing of these different languages, pseudo-documentary, and the little parts that were like psychic montages of Karen's state of mind that were more out of a sort of experimental tradition. That audiences of a much broader range than I would have expected were able to navigate easily from different narrative tropes. And I thought that was incredibly exciting and cool and encouraging about the state. And I realized that, audiences are sophisticated. This was a time when cable television was taking off, and there was a kind of, which has only continued to explode, obviously, in digital culture digital realms that we see today, that there was a sophistication among audiences. You can come into the middle of a horror film, and audiences, mainstream American audiences, flipping around their television sets would know exactly where they were in the narrative trajectory, out of a kind of fluency of various kinds of discourse. So that felt like something, like an opportunity to take further. And so formally, Poison was inspired by those sort of discoveries.
That realization, yeah.
Yeah. Thematically, of course, it was a direct relationship to what was happening politically and culturally in my life in New York at the time, the AIDS era, and the activist culture that I was starting to become involved in through ACT UP and various forms of political positioning around AIDS. And but I felt that Genet was a writer I had encountered in college and made a huge impact on my point of view as a gay person. And there was a backlash around AIDS in the early years where I think there was a sense of culpability and guilt that a lot of gay men felt about the experimentation, the sexual experimentation of the 1970s that they felt was the cause of HIV and its spread, and that I felt like something needed to be stated in a film or in a artistic work that addressed that and sort of challenged that sense of self-blame and castigation that was going on. And I felt like Genet, who was still alive at the time, was somebody who would have something to say about that. And I was very much aware that I was this American interpreter of Genet, and very self-consciously applying aspects of Genet's writing and thinking to extremely American generic traditions. So the three stories that make up Poison are American genres, some of the most mundane, popular genres, like the sort of domestic tabloid story,
reportage, yeah,
right out of television, and only one of them really tried to sort of enter into the world of Genet's novels thoroughly in the section subtitled Homo. but yeah, it was a labor of intense love. It was a film that was fully financed through arts grants, which later also came back to haunt it and create a secondary controversy after it was released by the National Endowment for the Arts grant that we received, and the way that endowment played into conservative far-right paranoias about funding of the arts and the content of work that was being funded by the government. But for that reason also, it was a very different kind of film experience to produce than anything I had done since subsequently after Poison. It felt like we were making an art project. We had a crew, we had a traditional, departments that would make that film possible. And I worked for the first time with Christine Vachon as my producer, who had more experience in independent filmmaking than I had, or that Barry Ellsworth, who'd shot Superstar and was a dear friend, had. But it still felt, and I think people who talk about the experience of making Poison at the time in 1989 and 90 place it in a kind of lost time, where films could be made in that spirit and with that sense of sort of collaborative, creative effort that really is more akin to art making than commercial filmmaking.
Okay, we have a clip of Poison that we can roll now.
Today, in the shadow cast by the penal oppressor of Baden, are the trusty and loyal inmates, Harold van Roven and John Broom, who hereby pledge to one another in the eyes of their comrades and fellows in misery their loyalty and faith to one another's body and soul. The ring on each man's finger will prove to them and those in their company that each is betrothed to the other for life and love until death prove otherwise. Place the rings on each finger and pledge to truth and faith above and beyond God the oppressor.
Ever since he was a child, Thomas Graves had been hungry for knowledge, hungry to discover all the secrets of the universe. Science, man's sacred quest for truth, was his first and only love. Years of hard work and research led him to the mysteries of the sex drive and its potential for the betterment of mankind. At the age of 32, Dr. Thomas Graves was called upon to present his theories to experts in his field.
And thus, as I have demonstrated, I have determined that once extracted, the application of the hormonal equivalent of the sexual instinct to practical neurology will not only provoke a dramatic reassessment of geriatric research, but will end paralysis as we know it today. Thank you.
This is ridiculous! I ask you, are we to take this charade seriously? I demand that this man be re-examined by the panel on grounds of medical incompetence.
I agree. Putrefacted condensation sustained, allowing molecular coagulation by producing biomagnetic gas. I did it. I did it.
Dr. Graves?
Yes, I'm Dr. Graves, and I've just captured the sex drive.
So, obviously, what we can see very clearly here, there are different narratives going on, even one in black and white and one in color. Did you have the impression while you were shooting it that you were making 3 films at the same time? Or, I mean, how was that shot?
In production, yes. We separated them out as 3 separate parts of the production process. As we did later on I'm Not There, due as much to the availability of actors as to the requirements of location and design. But in conception, no, they were very much conceived as a unit. And basically, to a large degree, it's the same story being told in 3 different generic traditions. And I was as interested in how the act of telling a story gets exposed by that process, so that people become aware or questioning who is telling the story. What are the attitudes implicit in this kind of telling? What are the prejudices and the sort of social traditions or blames or, positionings that generic tradition suggests? So that was so when I wrote the script, it was intertwined. When I let people read the script to bring them into the process, they had a sense that they were part of this triptych that was interwoven. Of course, in the editing process, many of those, some of the places remained the same, and they were built into how camera and sound and narrative requirements or progressions meant the 3 stories to interface. But of course, there were many that evolved in the editing process. Jim Lyons, who is the lead actor in the Genet section, the homo section, who plays Bolton, sort of the love object, who was my love object at the time, and was a real important influence and collaborator in my work as a filmmaker. Was primarily an editor, and we co-edited Poison together. But I really wanted him to star in it, because he was so perfectly suited to play Bolton. And he said, maybe I'll act in it if you promise to let me cut the movie. So I did.
So yeah, let's talk a bit about writing this film, because how different, I mean, now with the experience that you've had in writing more classical narratives as well, how different is it for you when you're writing, if you're writing something like this? Because obviously you have to think about how the different stories communicate between themselves.
Yeah, what's so funny is that my career as an independent filmmaker, a feature filmmaker, was something I never really set out to become or to be, and I think I still don't. I think I still find that definition strange in a way. It was the circumstances that followed the release of Poison that sort of formed me as a filmmaker in the eyes of the public, and in what followed as this moment of films coming out around this time that was defined as the new queer cinema. And that was as much a definition of a market for these kinds of films as it was validly a definition of the reasoning behind and the sort of necessity for several of these films to be made. Tom Kalin's Swoon as a seminal part of that that period of filmmaking.
Which is playing at the festival
Which
as
is
well.
playing in the
Yeah.
filmmaking at the festival, and Tom is here at the festival. So when I wrote Poison, I think I was still thinking of myself in terms of being an experimental filmmaker who was not necessarily, whose aim was not necessarily to reach as broad an audience as possible, even if I was interested in the ways audiences could navigate different kinds of generic traditions. I think the sensibility was one that I figured, like there were teachers that I encountered in college who were experimental filmmakers who taught in universities as a way of making their living, but had no constraints on their work that a commercial market or the definition of being a feature filmmaker would bring, you know? I think that's how I considered myself. It really wasn't until Poison really did entertain whatever, my work, I was fortunate to get critical reception and enough of an audience to each example of each film that sort of grew in size and scope to maintain that identity, but it was always an identity that I questioned to some degree.
You worked with Christine for the first time, Christine Vachon, the producer. Was there any point in the sort of very early stages of Poison where people would say to you, well, for your first feature, this might be too complicated, too experimental, you can only make a debut once, is this a good idea? Or did you get support from the very start?
We got support from the start, and like I said, we lived in this sort of bracketed bubble of being sort of semi in the art world and not really in the film world. We also were very lucky in that a distribution company, XIIth, that was just forming, who really got to know me through Superstar and wished they could distribute Superstar, had basically agreed to distribute Poison before we even finished the film. So I had a distributor for the film. It was a small, independent, tiny, little, cool, 2 women-run company out of New York. But we had a distributor. We didn't have to go and try to sell the movie at festivals. So there was a unique security in the way that we approached it. Also, what's been happening with independent film through these precise years in the United States is how films were evaluated as successful kept shifting with the next level of success that came along. So Poison made $1 million when it came out in 1991, and that was considered a success until Pulp Fiction happened.
Yeah.
And then from that point on, what was considered a success or what was considered sustainable changed. And we know this narrative. This is how Jaws changed the way feature filmmaking happened in the 1970s when it was massively released in one day. Yeah. And redefined what success meant and the whole way that studio systems were devised to replicate that exact scenario. And so it's a problem, and it's something that's you can't really go back. But I think it was always with a sense of reluctance to entering fully into that world and surrendering myself to that world. I lived purposefully in New York and not in Los Angeles, where I was raised as a kid. And I enjoyed that, and I didn't have an agent until after Velvet Goldmine, I think. I really kept them
at a distance.
At a distance, and it provided me with a freedom to imagine my own way of doing it and not really worry too much about what failure would mean or how it would be calibrated, but from a market sensibility,
So when you started imagining this, there are millions of references that went into the film. Obviously, Genet only being the first and most obvious one. We saw the bit in black and white, which feels like a sort of sci-fi drive-in movie from the 50s. How do you synthesize all these interests and all these influences that, obviously they come from your own interest in these things, I think, but how do you funnel that into one precise screenplay?
It was the content and the specific panic around HIV that determined the choices of what kinds of stories and the sort of level that they occupied in the sort of stature of narrative hierarchy. In other words, there was something pulp, obviously, about the horror section that was purposeful and worked well with our limited budget. And the fact that we wanted to dub the main actor's performance, all of that actually supported the slightly cheesy, semi-humorous style but also I think I was learning that a sort of degraded sense of expectations actually opens up an audience to a more profound and surprising emotional experience when they think it's going to be funny, like Superstar. When they think, oh man, Karen Carpenter told with Barbie dolls, that's a hoot, you know?
Yeah.
And then they're kind of open and kind of naked to an emotional discovery that they wouldn't have expected by watching. And I think that's true. There's some real poignant moments in the horror story in Poison that I don't think you're expecting. And they're more meaningful, more surprising, and maybe more resonant as a result. But there was something about the pulp nature, the crassness of the TV tabloid style doc, you know, set against a more romantic, literary style of the heroic story of the prison love romance in the third section. But I was, it wasn't like I was trying to tell a polished A-list Hollywood story. We were using specific genres that came out of, a kind of manipulation of emotion that felt crass and overstated, that to me reflected the media reaction to HIV at the time.
You already mentioned nuclear cinema. This was indeed one of the founding fathers, so to say, one of the films that sparked this whole concept of nuclear cinema, which I think was first defined in 1992, so just a year after Poison was released. Looking back now at the gay wedding scene that we saw earlier, I mean, in quite a few countries, and state of New York as well, it is a reality. Obviously, in 1991, we have to not forget that this seemed like a totally, ridiculous, idea that this was never going to happen. How important was it for you to? I mean, I think one of the characteristics of nuclear cinema is that it's going against what people think, should be done. It's something that is aggressive, and you're saying, it's not only okay to be gay, but gays also have they're human. They have flaws. They're just like everyone else. How important was it for you to be able to put that into the film? I think a gay wedding at that time, and you talked a little bit about the funding as well. That got you into trouble with the right. Yeah. So to what extent did you feel that it was a militant film that you were making? Obviously, the concept of nuclear cinema didn't exist at that time yet when you were actually making it. But
yeah.
To what extent did you feel you were making a militant film?
I definitely felt we were making a militant film, but also a militant film that, and maybe this is one of the reasons why AIDS is never mentioned in Poison. It's allegorical, and similarly in Safe. AIDS is mentioned in Safe,
but
sort of almost as a detour to throw you off course to what the film is really about. I felt that Genet is militant about queerness, and I felt that was what was needed, was a sense of strength and retaliation to a deeply shattered community that was listening too much to mainstream panic around causes and meaning attributed to HIV and illness in general, and Genet would probably roll over in his grave about gay marriage. I mean, what was interesting to Genet about homosexuality was how it undermined normalcy.
Yeah, it's transgressiveness.
Exactly, and its relationship to criminality is what excited him and imbued his work, his desire with a kind of violence and
pain.
A pain and a critique of dominance, that was always that homosexuality was always in the service of. And that was something that I still feel is essential and important about gayness and queerness. And so it's just bizarre that this sort of agenda of gay, when you think of any teenager coming out, of course you want them to know that gay marriage is an option and gays going into the military is an option, but there's other aspects of a coded status outside of mainstream society that has been lost since Stonewall and since all of the sort of legislative advancements that we've made as a community ever since. And I do have a mixed feeling about that. And Velvet Goldmine was also a funny film in that it was received coolly by the gay community when it came out, because I think it was so much more about, it resisted identity politics. It was about the blur between heterosexuality and homosexuality and maleness and femaleness. And, it was about that crazy, blurry moment in the early 70s where it was about mutability. And, gay people and straight people are unnerved by identities. That blur. We can all share in a sense of solid identity. And I've never been interested in solid identity. And if there's a single theme through all my films, it's that.
Okay. After this, the next feature that you made was Safe, that we already briefly talked about. We have a clip from that film as well. Okay.
Science tells us there.
Hi.
Hi.
Did you forget?
No, it's inside. I just,
What?
something happened. Come in.
How old was he?
5 years older. He was the oldest of my mom's kids.
It, wasn't.
No. That's what everyone keeps... Not at all. Because he wasn't married.
Right.
It's just so unreal. Did you see the den?
At your party, it's gorgeous.
You know, I'm suing the contractor. Did I tell you?
No.
You don't even want to know.
Sylvia! I'm home! Hello? Hi, Mother. What? No, I just walked in the door. That's all right. How are you feeling? How's your back? That's good. It's not a bad time, Mother. All right, that's fine. He's fine. They're fine. I will. Okay. I'll talk to you soon. Okay. Bye-bye. Fulvia! Any telephone while I was gone? Oh my God.
No, Mrs. No teléfono.
Is this what they delivered? Fulvia? We did not order black. This is not what we ordered. Yes, in Sherman Oaks. May I have the number for Nelson's on Riverside, please? I don't believe it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I saw you laughing there during the clip. Do you see a lot of your own stuff again after it's been released, or?
No, I haven't watched Safe in a while. Julianne is.
Well, that was the film I think that introduced Julianne to most people at the time, because she was not known at all. Yeah, it was one of her first major roles.
Yeah.
We really briefly talked about how this is an AIDS film as well, even though it's not mentioned very often. We have this beautiful scene here at the very beginning where the two ladies are sitting in the kitchen and they're talking about the death of her brother, but it's never mentioned in this scene.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about how you try to set that up? There's for those who haven't seen it, there's a character much later who actually has AIDS, but who's seen as a normal, normal. He's normally functioning. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
He's not ill and he's not bedridden or anything. But so could you talk a little bit about how why the scene is here, how that was set up?
Yeah. I forgot about that scene actually. But I love where she says, "No, not at all, not at all AIDS." You know. What interested me a lot around this film was the sort of recovery industry and the way in which illness is over-interpreted perhaps. And I was fascinated by Louise Hay, who was popular in the 80s, who was a kind of New Age healer type. New Age writer, and she would basically tell people suffering with AIDS and HIV that if they had loved themselves more, they wouldn't have gotten sick and they can overcome their illness. And so it became popular as a sort of methodology for ways of dealing with the enormity and the horror and the uncertainty of that illness before we had retroviral recourse. And how much people felt a sense of power in a powerless situation by attributing blame to themselves. And it made me think about how we often create meaning through a sense of culpability. When parents are getting divorced, their kids will say, is
there anything I could have done differently?
Yeah. Or is it because of me, mommy? Is daddy leaving because of me? That is the go-to position for how to understand the overwhelmingness of something like that, And similarly, I found it fascinating and disturbing that people wanted to take on, it's a sense of empowerment, Yeah,
they want to own it in a way.
To own it. And it's also, in many ways, a kind of free market ideology, kind of conservative ideology that says, it's your own fault for getting where you are. But that puts you in a hopeless position when you can't reverse it, And I just found all of that to be operative in the time in in a disturbing way. I also found the kind of free-for-all metaphoric possibilities of, environmental illness, or as it was being coined at the time, 20th century disease, to be a beautiful kind of blank slate onto which one could project so much, and the ways in which it affected housewives in their suburban environments, and that the only way for them to control their symptoms was to remove them from their environments into the most utterly foreign places, literally sterilizing their existence.
Which is what happens to Julianne.
Which is what happens to Julianne at the end. And what the film does, again, is it plays with another well-known sort of popular genre, the sort of disease movie of the week, which are often follow a character's discovery and identification of an illness, and since that illness is usually something that they can't overcome,
terminal,
the narrative resolution rests more in the subject's ability to kind of identify with the illness and the group of people
who face their fate,
to face their fate, and to share a sense of, definition with that particular group. And so the onus, again, it's almost like the onus is once again on the subject to resolve our narrative conflict and for us to feel free to leave this theater in the end. And this film follows that exact trajectory, so that at the end of the movie, Julianne looks into the mirror and says, "I love you, I really love you." But the signs have been placed along the way that this can't possibly be the right answer for her.
No, it's tragic.
It's tragic. Yeah. And so you're really, and yet it's followed the narrative tradition, and so the narrative trajectory, and it should relieve our sense of conflict narratively, And so I wanted there to be a conflict between how narratives are resolved and what the sort of social messaging is embedded in that, and how they don't comply, and there's something wrong there that one could stand in opposition to. That's...
what I wanted to talk a bit about, I think when it came out, maybe the connection with AIDS was not directly made by a lot of people. Also because environmental disease is not exactly the same as AIDS.
No, of course not.
So people were, sort of thrown off track. And then in that scene that we just saw, AIDS is not even mentioned.
Right. And if anything, when Peter Dunning, the head of Wrenwood, the recovery center that she is sent to, is defined as somebody who has AIDS, that's meant to be a narrative trigger that that he's a good guy.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, he has AIDS, he's gonna be a good character. And so again, it throws you off track. It completely derails you from what his agenda is and what that whole recovery practice is aiming to do. And then you start to watch him forcing people to acknowledge their own culpability in abuse that they've received in family situations, or in not loving themselves enough and bringing on...
You can always find something.
Yeah, exactly. You can always find something.
Yeah, but I think, what's interesting about the film is it came out in 1995.
Yeah.
But it is a period film. You can't really see that here maybe, but it's actually set in 1987, which is a very significant year in terms of AIDS, where Reagan, for the first time, talked about it, finally.
Yeah.
And where ACT UP was founded as well, which you were involved in. So how important was that for you to, was that one of the reasons why you chose that year, to make a period film?
I don't remember that necessarily being the reason. I did want to set it back, and I always sort of have this desire to reframe the setting, the time and place of a film.
You've never made a contemporary film.
I've never made a contemporary film. This is about this is pretty close.
This is what,
to
8
have
years?
an 8-year difference. But I feel like just putting a frame around a story asks an audience to think about it in a slightly larger way and to extrapolate.
It creates some distance,
Yeah, and in many ways, that's why I think I choose did choose these more allegorical ways of discussing AIDS, and in ways, there was a lot of really important groundbreaking documentary work happening at the time about HIV. There was stuff happening about the almost month-by-month struggle toward finding drugs that worked, dosages that worked, changing the way sufferers of AIDS were being defined and characterized in society, that I felt was doing that job beautifully. And so I felt what I could do was to step back and talk about a lot of these themes and how they are, have a larger significance and have a more, play a part in a larger narrative about identity, illness, and meaning.
I chose this clip not only because we have that first scene there in the kitchen, but also because after that you get that beautiful shot of her standing to the very side and talking to her mother on the phone, and you sort of take in that the way her home's decorated, where there's not a tiny little thing out of place.
Yeah.
And then obviously what happens, the camera goes backward and she sees that horror and she's like, oh my God, there's a black couch sitting in my living room.
Yeah, exactly.
Or, one part of her
it's
enormous
like
living room.
The monolith in 2001.
Exactly, yes. It's just this, and it's a black splotch really in a white environment. So that's another sort of
in
cue.
Carol White's environment.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the visual approach? I mean, how did you try to translate the information about the character visually?
Well, and in many ways, this character of Carol White, who was almost a cipher on the page, a character who challenged. It was another thing that I sort of loved learning from the experience of making Superstar, is that audiences so want to identify with characters. I think we underestimate the work audiences do to make stories come to life. They are really just projections on the wall until an audience is there to fill them in with meaning and with emotion. And so, but in a way, the harder you make that process, up to a point, the more you discover about how eager a viewer is to fill it in and to enter into the narrative space and make it real for themselves. And these questions about identity have a very close relationship to identification, and that's an active process that a viewer undergoes every time we watch a film, is how to make it a vehicle for our own trajectory as an audience. So just as Karen Carpenter was portrayed by a doll that you fill in, you connect this non-moving mouth with the story and do all the work to make it congeal. Similarly, Carol White is this evasive blank who's defined as much by her environment as she is in any innate way. And so the objects in her house had to almost compete with her size and importance. She's modeling herself not only on her peers and the way they talk and the way they dress, but in the very objects that surround her and in many ways dwarf her, So that scene is a great example of that relationship. So I looked at films where decor and a controlled camera and a sort of chilly sense of recycled air, is really what you experience in some of the great masters of constraint like Kubrick.
XIIth is a film about disease. We saw, we didn't see the clip, but it's also a big part of the horror science fiction part in Poison. Karen Carpenter obviously was also disease. What's so fascinating for you about disease that it keeps coming back in your work?
It certainly had a great deal to do with the time and place, as we've discussed. But I think in all of these stories where identity is challenged in various ways, and sometimes affirmatively, usually in the films I've made about artists like Rimbaud, Bob Dylan, and the glam rock artists of the 1970s, identity is challenged creatively and resisted creatively and dismembered creatively. In these stories that are often about women in domestic settings that follow more melodramatic traditions, identity is something that one presumes is intact, and the process of telling the story is something that calls those assumptions into question. So disease is a beautiful example of that, where the body is in revolt against the person before the person is even aware of that problem, So in all these, and in 20th century illness, environmental illness, it's a classic example of the body saying no before the mind and the consciousness is even there. So she learns, in many ways, SAFE is interesting because the middle of SAFE is the most hopeful part, where everything is falling apart and she's having these seizures and she's having these physical reactions to her environment, and her body is saying no, her body is protesting. And then she gets put back together, you know, in this recovery setting. And she thinks it's the answer, and everyone's telling her it's the answer, and yet she's getting these cysts on her head that are getting as big as her eyes, you know.
Yeah.
And you know there's symptoms that are telling you it's not the answer. But narratively, we're supposed to believe that it is, and she as a character is being told by her society and by her environment that it is. So there's that conflict, but the middle is the place where everything is up for grabs, and that's the most hopeful part of the film.
And I think what's interesting about Disease as a filmmaker, I guess, as well, is that it's something visual. I mean, it tells you something about what's going on inside the character, at least the way you treat disease in your films, visually.
Yeah.
Without having to do a lot of you know, exposition on what's going on inside them, because it shows on their bodies.
And there's, you know, in Poison, it has a humorous, grotesque quality. You know, it has this, you know, there's a fixation on bodily, you know, spewing of blood and pus and semen and sweat and all of those things. And there's all these shots of hands exploring objects, you know, throughout Poison, in the clip you showed as well. And then there's that scene where the pus is coming out of his head into his hot dog while they're having lunch. And it's funny, but it's also incredibly sad. And there's this beautiful, beautiful scene in Ali Fear Eats the Soul, Fassbinder's film, that it's quoting, where the middle-aged woman and the Turkish man who she is seeing are having lunch at this coveted restaurant that was one of Hitler's favorite restaurants in Munich. And they're having this lovely moment together, but it's a black man and a white middle-aged woman, and the waiters are standing staring daggers at them, and they grab each other's hands, and the camera starts a slow lateral track. And it's one of the most poignant moments in all of Fassbinder. It's a heartbreaking moment of these two people isolated in their forbidden love for each other.
Yeah, even when they're together, they're not really together because the others are sort of, you know, staring them apart, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it makes for the most romantic kind of bond, really.
Yeah, if it's almost impossible, yeah.
Exactly.
Of course, yeah. Next film after this was Velvet Goldmine. We have a clip of that one as well, so let's have a look.
Ten years and the world had changed so completely that the life I led in England seemed like someone else's life. Someone else's story. Anyone's but mine.
There were times when it appeared to Dorian Gray that the whole of history was merely a record of his own life. Not as he had lived it in act and circumstance, but as his imagination had created it for him, as it had been in his brain and in his passions. He felt that he'd known them all, those strange, terrible figures that had passed along the stage of life and made sin so marvelous and evil so full of subtlety. It seemed that in some mysterious way their lives had been his own.
I won't laugh at you when you boo-hoo-hoo, 'cause I love you. I can turn my back on the things you like, 'cause I love you. I just like the things you do. Don't you change the things you do. This is
Can you lend us a couple of quid? I got money.
You must be mental.
Oh, please, it's where I got it.
Piss off.
Thanks.
What's it for?
Nothing.
Give it here then. Let's have a look.
Bloody Nora.
Oh, kid's one of them pansy rockers. Fucking hell. It's a fucking puff, that one there.
It's not.
That's naff. That's naff.
You're disgusting. You know that?
Well, you're the grand one, have you noticed? When you're walking, all the fairy birds are very nervous. Well, my starship doesn't want man, and neither does his world. I'm glad I caught you on my view screen. Sailor, you're the grand one, come and call me. This wooing is one of morning. When my spacesuit comes to hold me like a girl.
I'm just going out with it.
I am a captain of your gravity, Max Wade. Everywhere I see your face there. From a starship over Venus to the sun. But it's a crime, your mystica, momentary seizure of love, of love. Well, you're the ground one, have you noticed?
Today in London, officials confirmed that the shooting on the 5th of February of singer Brian Slade at London's Lyceum Theatre was a publicity stunt, mounted by the singer's company, Bijou Music Limited. Manager Jerry Devine announced today that his company meant no harm in their escapades, that it was intended solely as entertainment.
Very unfortunate, very sad and unfortunate that in this day and age, an artist's quest for artistic freedom should cost him his career.
Duncan, see.
Yeah, how long was it since you'd seen that clip?
I actually just did a commentary track for Velvet Goldmine. When it came out, Miramax Films had Harvey Weinstein had a lot of notes on Velvet Goldmine. He was thankfully not a producer of the actual film, the production itself. They just bought it as for distribution, so he had no final say. And I rejected basically all of his notes. And so he basically sort of dumped it, you know. And it was also the year of Shakespeare in Love and Life is Beautiful, so he had his hands full with golden eggs of his preference. And so when the film came out on DVD, they didn't even ask me to do a commentary track, you know, and I was like, anyway, and that's when it was all in my head, all of the research and the backstory. It was so fresh, and I'd been researching it for years, and so I was just asked to do a commentary track right now for a Christmas release because it's another company took over the library, and I was like, shit, I have to get the research together because Velvet Goldmine, more than any of my other films, has enjoyed scholarship among fans and a sort of obsessive fantastic relationship among followers of the film over the years. And I felt like I owed it to those wonderful people to do a thorough and detailed commentary track. So I went back to the fan sites to read all of the annotations, right, that they had so lovingly bestowed on the film all these years. And I could not have done the commentary without their work, and I made that very clear at the beginning of my commentary. So I just watched it recently. It's more fresh in my mind.
One of the things that we see in this clip, which I think is a very important thing for all your films, we briefly touched on it earlier, is the notion of time and that how time changes your perspective on things. What is so fascinating for you about, having that, like here, I think there's a 10-year interval between when the Christian Bale character is researching it and, when he's actually young.
Right.
What is so fascinating about, that in that interval that changes perspective on everything? I think he says something like, it feels like it's not even me.
Yeah.
Well, it's the Oscar Wilde thing that's happening in the beginning there.
Yeah. I think it might all come down to this beautiful quote of Fassbinder's that I'm just paraphrasing, that says, you can't give people the revolution. You have to show them the conditions in society that make the revolution necessary. And then it's up to them to make their revolution. But when you hand them the revolution, you've taken away their own agency, And, it is true, films like Velvet Goldmine and I'm Not There explore moments in pop cultural history that are revolutions and that are that I find radical and
they're breaking points
and hopeful, and full of passion and excitement and possibility that are very rare. And so I think I felt, and there's other reasons as well, but I felt like I wanted to make it lost, something of the past, buried within itself, because even the 1984 framing story in Velvet Goldmine comes out of the language of Glitter Rock, which was talking about a 1984 somewhat inspired by Orwell and Bowie, and comprised accordingly as a degraded, lost, debauched, time. And so it's purloined. It's a time that we don't have immediate access to, but with the right lineage and the right glitter dust, you might just be able, and the right record collection, you might just be able to touch it or invent it for yourself.
Another thing that we see in this clip here is Christian Bale's character, basically falling in love with his record and finding himself through that, and you see him walking down the street, or strutting down the street rather, I think, for the first time. How important is it for young people, especially young gay people, to have these examples and these icons? And a secondary question attached to that, is that a more personal moment for you as well? I mean, in terms of is it autobiographical?
It is and it isn't. I mean, I think I love the moment. I mean, it is in the sense that pop cultural moments provide all of us with these imaginary ascensions from our suburban loneliness and our grim depression as adolescents, and the possibility of so much more. And there are crazy accidental moments in culture like Glitter Rock, where all of the signs get mixed and it's like wrong, and it's amazing that it happened.
Yeah, it shouldn't have existed.
It shouldn't have existed, but it did, But I remember, but I also love in that clip you showed that it has the eroticness of the materiality of the vinyl moment that we covet, and all of that. That feels more lost today than it did even when we made Velvet Goldmine. But also, he turns the page and sees the men kissing, and there's this whoa, that aversion, that fear. And that's how I felt when I first saw Bowie. When I first saw images of Bowie as an adolescent, I was like, ooh, this is scary. This freaks me out. I can't handle this. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was speaking quite deeply to something in me, and that's what was the source of that fear and that, and you know, and anxiety and ambivalence. And it would be later in college that I was able to obsess and immerse myself thoroughly in that time and those images and ideas. But yeah, I remember it being dangerous. And that's another fantastic thing about pop culture, that it can be dangerous in that way and really touch nerves that are buried or just beginning to find their way out, you know, and anticipate that process almost in advance of you.
Yeah, it can sort of worm its way into your subconscious in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, make you realize things that you didn't even know you actually felt, or that were inside you. Yeah.
And does that happen anymore? It does, because all this stuff is still there, and I think it's shocking to every kid, you know, and it can be. You know, I remember a story of a kid who wrote me a letter when it was before Velvet Gold Mine. I think it was just around Poison and maybe Safe. And he went to the high school I went to. My last 4 years, I went to a private arty high school in Los Angeles. And they, on the bulletin board, they put up an article about me as an openly gay filmmaker. And I got a letter from a kid who knew my brother, who's 10 years younger than I am. And the kid wrote a letter like, you know, "Dear Mr. Haynes, I read the article about you and that you're gay, and it's really, you know, amazing because I think I might be gay, and you know, I have a crush on my best friend, but nobody knows that I'm gay." And you know, all of a sudden there's a big gap in the middle of the letter, and he says, "Oh my God, this was sitting on my typewriter, and my mother came in and read the letter." And then we had a talk with my dad, and my dad, you know, and my mom said, "I love you, honey, no matter what, you are the best kid." And the dad said, "I love you, son, you're the best kid in the world, no matter who you are." I told my best girlfriends in school, and they said, "You're so cool that you're gay." And I told my friend who I have a crush on, and he said, "I love you, man, as a friend." And then the kid goes, "And it's so awful." And you realize that no matter how good the conditions are under which one comes out, you know, there's this profound difference. And I don't think it's just people who are gay. I just think people...
I think as teenagers, you want to fit in, you know, you want to belong.
It's a teenager wants to fit in, and it's that it's never easy, it's never right, it's never effortless, you know, and we struggle to fill in these roles that we're told to play, and it never is seamless, you know. And I just find that to be that story never goes away, you know, because of course you want the conditions to be better for people to be themselves and find out who they are, but it's always hard, and we're always uncertain, you know, and we're always grabbing from the society to tell us that we're doing it right.
Obviously here, yeah, you were inspired by Bowie and the whole glam rock movement. A lot of pop stars and pop references in all your films, Karen Carpenter as well, Bob Dylan. How do you select who to make a film about? Is it really, you know, does it come from a story point of view? Are you looking at a story, or is it first you love their music and then you try to see how, you know, to create a story around that? How does that work?
It varies from project to project. With Velvet Goldmine, Jim Lyons, who I mentioned earlier, was my editor and lover. We were on a vacation together. He said, "I have this idea about making a film about masculinity in society and the ways it gets codified in various institutions. And it should be a 3-part movie, one about the military, one about the church, and one about glam rock." And I was like, that is so fucking cool, but the glam rock story alone is a movie. It warrants a movie unto itself. And so we set out, we said, you know, I said, let's do this together. Let's write this together. Let's do it. And it never totally worked out to write the script together. We wrote the story together, Jim and I, and he cut it. And but I found it to be so invariably, perfect for a visual medium.
And it's never been done before up until that point,
never really
I think.
been done before.
Which doesn't make any sense because it's so visually
so visual,
impressive.
so what's so funny about glam rock is how radically present it was, and then how absent it also is at the same time. There was no single book on glam rock in existence when I made Velvet Goldmine. There was like little paperbacks on Bowie that you can find in the stalls of Camden Town in London, in retro stores or whatever that were out of print, or biographies of artists. But Bowie wasn't really gay, and Queen was a stadium rock artist, rock band, you know what I mean? Or Gary Glitter was a stadium football and band, it was like, wait a minute, Queen, Freddie Mercury, like all the signs of excessive femininity and androgyny and homosexuality were effaced from these sort of emblems of cultural memory. It needed to be sort of reminded to the culture of what it was. And in fact, what's so funny is Bowie's own reaction to Velvet Goldmine is so interesting, because he likes to say, I know he had objections to the film being made to begin with. He even, I think we heard later that he was trying to erect a lawsuit against the film while making it, which he couldn't do because he's a public figure, and we don't even use his name. It's all fictionalized. But in press, for his official reaction to the film, he says, I love the gay parts. I love how the gay filmmaker put his own gayness into the story and made it so gay. And getting around the argument, basically, I mean, it wasn't me who went mincing up and down the stage in a feather boa in 1972 and coming out in
with that makeup on,
and coming out in Melody Maker magazine and saying, I'm gay, I've always been gay, my whole life. And, it's remarkable because he was so radical and so brilliant and so literate. He knew the traditions of the dandy and of Oscar Wilde and the English music hall traditions.
The sort of godfather of glam rock.
Absolutely,
here,
but he was stimulated by the ideas of his time and of that particular British legacy. But he applied it to a kind of hardcore American anti-hippie influence of the Stooges and Velvet Underground and the kind of rejection of the hippie peace and love generation. My brother's back at home with his Beatles and his Stones, really demarcating a different generation. And glam rock was born from that. It was a radical move, and it was a conscious move, and it was savvy, and it was. And Angela Bowie, in her wonderful book on the whole period, said, is very articulate as well about saying, we have to do this now because of the gay liberation movement and because of what's happening right now in the streets. It's up to us to do this, honey. We got to take the lead. And they were inspired by the crazy Warhol, second-generation Warhol freaks who came to London and did this play called Pork, and had cut their hair into short shags and dyed them crazy colors and shaved off their eyebrows and covered themselves with glitter. And Bowie was still in his long hair and his floppy hat when he met them, and they all thought he was a little dull, but Angela they thought was awesome. And the next time they see Bowie, he's got the short hair and the shaved off eyebrows, and he's wearing clothes designed by one of them, So he was savvy and brilliant, and it's too bad that I was really trying so hard to apply the language and the stylistic rule book of glitter rock to a narrative film experience and make it absolutely, a dream voyage back in time and a celebration of the unnatural in every possible way. And I thought he would dig that, At least Brian Eno and Brian Ferry came to Cannes for the premiere of the film, and were sitting right behind me next, who hadn't spoken to each other after Eno left Roxy Music in 1973 for like 25 years, and now they were reunited.
Thanks to your film.
Totally. They were, and
You should take credit for that, yeah.
Absolutely. And because Bowie said no to all the music we wanted of his songs in the film, it opened up a space for the great Eno and Roxy stuff that is lesser known and as extraordinary.
I think an important part of this film, more than even the other two films where you talk about artists, is the performance part of it. Because obviously glam rock was so much about the visuals as well as the music.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about how that figured into, creating the screenplay and setting that whole thing up? Because obviously you have to think not only about the story, but also about how it's going to look.
Velvet Goldmine was the first sort of method script I wrote, where I felt it necessary to cut my hair into a Ziggy Stardust haircut and dye it red and blow dry it every morning and wear platform boots and wear little midriff tops and feel the air going up your clothes. That women must feel, and guys don't know what that feels like, and to feel like kind of teetering on a high shoe with your hair, with the wind going through your hair and up your shirt, and have nail polish on and put on mascara. And while we were promoting Safe, I was dressed this way because I was doing research on Velvet Goldmine, and people were like, "What the fuck are you doing? This makes no sense at all." Yeah, it was a thorough, if it started from, obviously I had my own love of the music, my own history with the music, but it started as a conceptual interest in the ideas behind this moment in history that Jim opened up as an idea that I went for, but it became thoroughly internalized in the process. Whereas the Dylan film came like a surprise. I loved Bob Dylan so much in high school, right at that time when you're feeling a defiance and you need a courageous voice, to kind of propel you out of yourself or out of your world. And what's funny is I really hadn't listened to Dylan for years, all through the 90s. I had stopped listening to Bob Dylan, and at a transitional period in my life in New York, I had a silly, bad relationship ended, and it brought me down. And I was questioning whether in New York had changed, and I was just like, do I really want to live here anymore? And I just wasn't. Everything was unsure, and all of a sudden I had to hear Dylan, and I started to play Bob Dylan music all the time, and I started to read these biographies. And it came almost like this uncontrolled internal hunger for something to latch onto, a kind of force that I needed. And obviously, it was that brilliant adolescent force, that you need to return to at times of your life to generate real change. And it did. It brought me to Portland, Oregon. This is actually before I did Far From Heaven. Dylan just propelled me away from a life I'd had for 15 years in New York City. I drove to the West Coast. I started kind of a new life, met all these fantastic new people, and had this idea of a multiple character biography of this amazing subject. But and I just sort of put it in the back of my head and wrote Far From Heaven because I knew I wanted to do a melodrama again with Julianne. And but it was a very rich, creative, fertile period where both I'm Not There and Far From Heaven were sort of happening and being created at the same time.
Born together.
Yeah.
We have a clip of Far From Heaven. Can you show us the second clip? That was the first clip.
The other one?
Yeah, the other clip, yeah. Yeah, the second one.
not to say that I'm against integration, mind you. I do believe it's the Christian thing to do. But I still say what happened in Little Rock could just as easily have happened here at Hartford.
Nonsense.
Well, why is that?
Well, for one thing, there's no Governor Faubus in Connecticut. But the main reason? There are no Negroes.
No, but there are some rather dangerous pro-integration types right here in Hartford.
Dangerous?
Oh, yes. Some very attractive ones, in fact. Noted, I'm told, for their kindness to Negroes.
Oh, Dick, stop. Where on earth did you hear about that?
Shirley read it to me.
I should have known.
What's all this?
Absolutely nothing. Now, let me freshen those. Excuse me, please.
Oh, by golly, there she is now, the purtiest gal in her room.
Stan, liquor brings out the Texan in you. I hope Eleanor isn't listening.
So what if she is? I still say Frank is the luckiest guy in town.
Here, here. It's all smoke and mirrors, fellas. That's all it is. You should see her without her face on.
Frank? No, he's absolutely right. We ladies are never what we appear, and every girl has her secrets. I'll say.
How about this girl going and getting her husband another drink?
Darling, don't you think you've already had it?
No, I don't think I've had it.
I'd just like to take a moment to raise a glass to our marvelous host and hostess and another glorious annual party at the Whitakers. To Frank and Kathy, truly Mr. and Mrs. Magnatech. My goodness, thank you very much. Now, who can I freshen up? Ron?
No, I'm fine.
Not me.
Oh, I think you're fresh enough. All right.
Here, Mrs. Whitaker, let me take that.
Oh, thank you, Sybil.
Kathy,
Hi.
honey, is everything all right?
Why? What do you mean?
Frank, I've never seen him so soused.
Oh, he's been working so hard lately. He's under tremendous strain.
You sure that's all?
Oh, yes.
You'd tell me if there was anything more.
Of course I would.
Well, kid, I think we just threw ourselves one Class A swanky function.
It did turn out nicely, didn't it?
Kathleen, darling, you've simply outdone yourself once again.
Thank you so much. Frank? Well, if I do say so myself, it was a lovely party, all considering. I just wish it didn't have to turn ugly in front of our friends. Honestly, Frank, if you didn't insist on... What is it?
Jesus! What's happening? I can't even... God!
It doesn't matter. The important thing is to keep trying.
Don't!
What?
Because... I'm sure, you know, Dick Dawson wouldn't mind lending his services every once in a while.
Frank.
I mean, you wouldn't mind that so much, would you? Good-looking guy like Dick. Maybe even stand the pitch in.
Frank, you're the only man that I've ever wanted.
Just let go.
Frank, you're all meant to me. You're all man.
Stop it! Kathy, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's
I
all right.
didn't mean to.
I'm all right. It's an accident.
Are you bleeding?
Oh, just the littlest bit. Perhaps, you could get me some ice here.
Ice?
Yes.
Kathy.
I know. It's all right. I'm all right.
I think one of
hard
the
to see.
one of the key scenes of the film, I think. One of the reasons why I chose this fragment here is that what's so interesting about it is that you immediately see the whole facade of trying to have to fit in to society, and I think party scenes in general are great for that. There's one in Safe as well, where they have the shower, and you can see that everyone is trying to be on their best behavior, and at the same time, everyone is also trying to figure out how the others are doing, and if they can discover any sort of faults. And parties are interesting for that. And then, of course, here you have that scene straight after where it's just the two of them, and they can openly discuss what's going on. So my question really is about melodrama melodrama is something based on artifice and true emotion, like getting to true emotion through artifice. Something that somehow gay directors seem to be much more in tune with than quite a few straight directors. Obviously, this is inspired by Douglas Sirk. You already mentioned Fassbinder, who was one of the first to bring that sort of the American Sirk, so to say, to Europe. Ozon and Almodovar, other ones. You're another one. What is it about melodrama that you find so fascinating? I think, in a way, you could describe all your films as melodramas in the sense that they're constructed on artifice, have a sort of narrative artificiality, but are about deeper emotional truths.
Mm-hmm. I mean, really, maybe all film is melodrama, because they're all artifice, they're all artificial. And again, we bring the life blood to them. I think there's something that happens with the self-consciously artificial style that, again, creates a separation in a viewer between reading a story, reading subjects in a film on the screen, and again, that kind of surprise of emotion that you don't see coming. I remember watching Far From Heaven at the first screening we did in Portland, and there was a friend of mine who was sitting next to me, and he was, it was that laughter of recognition through the whole movie, and it was starting to bug me. And people have felt it when they've been in film classes and they'll show a Cirque film, and there's that tittering all the way through of the datedness of the 50s, of the codified characters and so forth. And teachers will say, no, don't laugh, there's something beneath this. Hold on, go past the surface and see what's there. What's interesting about melodrama is it's all on the surface. But this guy was watching Far From Heaven, and he was giggling, but I know he was with the movie. He was appreciating what it was doing. And then at one point, at this late scene in the film where Julianne meets the gardener character, Dennis Haysbert, and they go to say goodbye at his house. And she says something like, I can't remember the exact lines, but she says something like, maybe he's moving to Hartford. He's moving to Philly or something, where his brother, Baltimore, where his brother lives. He has to get out of Hartford, and since her marriage is over, she says, maybe I could meet you there. She says no one would know us there, and she's starting to break. There's something fragile, and the guy next to me was laughing, and all of a sudden, he started to cry, like literally in a hair's split. Yeah. It changed, and I think that's what melodrama provides. That's what can happen. You almost don't realize how close those emotions are. A sense of recognition, distance, amusement, tagging meaning onto a generic style, and then all of a sudden it touching something so unexpectedly truthful about life, And there's that beautiful quote of Fassbinder's, won't get it right, about imitation of life. Cirque's Imitation of Life, where he said, you know, something like, we watched the movie, and at the end of the movie, when, you know, the black daughter, you know, rejects who's passing as white, rejects the black mother, we all cried. And he said, we all cried because, it's so beautifully stated in the original, and I'm fucking it up, but, you know, we all cried because we knew that the only way this could work is if, you know, we changed the world, and it's so hard to change the world. And he, you know, everyone just wept because of that. And just the way he said it was so beautiful and so accurate. The impossibility of these relationships. And what I wanted to do with Far From Heaven, I remember this, I just wanted to somehow make a diagram of a story where nobody was at fault, but that everybody, just in pursuing their desires, was going to wound and hurt somebody else.
Yeah, they're on a collision course.
It was a collision course, and it was like, if anything, it was a perfect diagram of pain, residually, where everybody would be wounded accordingly in this little knot, and it just happened to take on race, gender, and sexuality in at the same time. But it was just important to not have it be a villainous. There would be no villainous character, and of course, there's a hierarchy of possibilities amongst the characters, where in many ways the gay man becomes the freest to pursue his desire because he can do it undercover.
Yeah, that's the interesting part. Obviously, the big difference here in the film is the black man is visible. There's no way he can hide. The gay man, he can you know, do it at night in his office, and no one theoretically is there. So
Exactly.
So that's a very big difference between those two, obviously.
Yeah, but that the woman is ultimately the bottom rung, and has to maintain the burden of maintaining the family institution in the end, and has to give up the most as a result.
Yeah, because theoretically, I mean, she's the cornerstone of the family. That's what, you know, the foundation of, you know, what the family is built on, constructed on. Yeah.
Right.
Obviously, one of the things that's interesting here, we're in a 50s style melodrama, very close to Cirque, also in terms of the way it's shot and the costumes and the colors.
Yeah.
And but obviously, with the story that would have never been able to, you know, it wouldn't have been able in a film from the 50s. So in that sense, there's another layer of artifice on top of that. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how you take texts, you know, other films or novels or music influences, and you try and I mean, it's never just quoting, it's never just homage. There's always something that you add to it, or something that you subvert, something that you twist.
Mm-hmm.
So could you talk a little bit about that process? I mean, how does that work when you're working on your screenplays, when your ideas are coming together?
In a funny way, with Far From Heaven, I wasn't that interested in let's insert a gay story into it, because that would be the sort of twist of something that wouldn't have been possible, you know, in a 50s Circean film. In many ways, all melodramas always exposed a kind of social subject matter that was taboo, you know, and they venture into dangerous territory. The theme of passing as white in Imitation of Life, and these are stories that originated in 1930s films by Stahl that Fassbinder remade. I mean that Cirque remade in the 1950s. Same with Magnificent Obsession. So there was always a sense of, you know, or Peyton Place, or, you know, dealing with rape and dealing with family taboos. There was always a sense of this sort of tabloid theme being exposed in a domestic setting. And we all read Cirque films differently now because of Rock Hudson's homosexuality. And knowing that Cirque discovered Rock Hudson and purposefully knew about his sexuality, as everyone did who worked with him, and chose to cast him as the male love object in these heterosexual, you know, stories that never really work and never feel authentic and never feel absolutely truthful, you know. those were conscious decisions that he was making at the time. So they're imbued with layers of knowledge and meaning that, and in many ways I'm sort of taking that one step further. But if anything, I was really being, I think maybe I was making an homage. I mean, I was trying to apply, I was not being nearly as, original as Fassbinder was in adapting All That Heaven Allows as Ali Fear Eats the Soul and setting it in contemporary Germany in 1974, and setting it with a Turkish man and a middle-aged working-class woman. I was being utterly faithful to the milieu of the Cirque films and the setting of a Cirque film, and humbling myself at the artistry of how those films were put together, and again wanting to learn by doing so. But by doing that in 2002, I knew I was like taking a huge risk that this would be maybe my most experimental film. And in fact, it was my most, crossover film or something. Mainstream film. And I'm looking at this clip. I haven't looked at the film in a really long time, and I'm going, I can't believe Far From Heaven touched as many people as it did. And I think that's so fascinating and so great, because it means that these forms work, they sustain, they
still work.
They still really work. And what they do, it's something that I've never really considered myself. Like, I think Hitchcock is the best example of this. As somebody who works in the most popular language, trying to reach the broadest audience, but always subverting injecting a pathology that is universal into the experience of identifying with a central character. So you become implicated in these stories. You become guilty of the murder of the suspected this or that in a Hitchcock film. And you start to feel like all of the social pathologies that we try to brush off and try to say, no, I'm not culpable, I'm not guilty. I would never do that. Yeah. I would never do that. We are guilty watching a Hitchcock film. And that universal sense of guilt that we are, as formed, subjected people in society, carry with us secretly in our pockets and in our shadows and in our closets, is exposed in this most popular tradition of what Hitchcock does. Cirque does it in a different way, but it's the same idea. And again, I remember a story of a woman watching Far From Heaven who was in the film industry, and she hadn't got around to seeing it, and she finally got it on DVD, and she took it home, and she had her 3-year-old daughter on her lap watching the movie, and she thought the daughter fell asleep while she was watching it, and at the end of the film, she looks down, and the little girl is crying, and the little girl she says, honey, what's the matter? Are you okay? And she says, Mommy, why can't that nice lady be with that nice man? And I realized, like, with Far From Heaven, I had done that really simple but sort of universal thing, that communicates with a popular language and uses the core possibility of the film experience to tell a universal story and communicate beyond meaning, in the purest sense. I mean, words I hate, pure and all that shit, when it really uses the artificial language in the most beautiful way and uses the pure construction of light and color, in the Circean tradition. And as I said, everything is on the surface. Psychological depth is basically eschewed in the classic domestic melodrama. And that's another really interesting about how it operates.
Okay, let's go and put the clip of the next film. I'm not there, because I think we're sort of running out of time, so.
Greenwich Village, once the in spot for beatnik jazz and bebop, is today home to the popular folk music fan, a do-it-yourself musical expression that's attracted youngsters from all across the nation. For them, these homespun songs of the working man express a truth and candor sorely lacking in today's growing consumer society. Why do you prefer folk music to other types of music?
Because it's honest. Commercial songs, pop music, can't be honest. It's controlled and censored by the people who run society and make the rules.
Yet among the many new and talented artists to emerge, one name stands alone as the heart and soul of this growing musical trend, a young individual who both writes and performs some of his era's finest tunes, and hailed by the New York Times as folk music's troubadour of conscience. His name is Jack Rollins.
Jack Rollins, folk sensation of the early 60s, was the promise of a new generation. So what was it that made him run at the height of his career and throw it all away, trading in the limelight for a different kind of light altogether?
He saw what was going on in the world, and he had the ability to distill it into a song.
He could do a funny thing. He could do a pathos thing. He was sensational.
For the times they are changing.
This young man has taken to the hearts of young people who seem to somehow identify with Jack. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. I guess I got a lot of thoughts inside of me, and most people they keep them all inside. I guess it's for them that I do what I do.
Today, the name Jack Rollins might best be remembered as the tortured singer battling his conscience in the 1965 drama Grain of Sand. The role, of course, that launched the career of Hollywood rebel Robbie Clark.
Hell, I don't pick what I sing. It picks me. Some of it ain't pretty. I mean, how you ever gonna change anything if you only want to show what's pretty?
In his first exclusive interview in 20 years, tonight we bring you face to face with the real Jack Rollins.
Williams and Zinger killed poor Hattie Carroll with the cane that he twirled round his diamond ring finger.
He saw what was going on in the world, and he had the ability to distill it into a song. This elevated the discussion, I mean, certainly within the folk world, but all through popular music, that the bar had risen.
Alice Fabian was herself a leading figure in the folk revival, achieving international success a few years before their first meeting in 1962.
Hey, you're in my chair. I was at a party in the village, and this torpy little kid who'd been hanging around, kind of flirting with my baby sister and kissing up to me, starts playing these songs that he'd written on guitar. Now, this was 61, 62, and all anybody sang were traditionals, and here's this kid applying traditional form to contemporary concerns, but with such insight, you know, it was devastating. You couldn't believe this was coming out of this little toad, and nobody was writing songs like that. It was as if he was giving voice to ideas that I wanted to express, but didn't know how. His finger pointing songs, he called them, and he was turning them out like ticker tape.
Well, folk music has always been a political music, but he was really expressing it as an art form in a way that was multi-leveled and very deep.
I think I'm Not There.
It's a funny clip.
Yeah. You understand in a second why I picked this particular bit, but what I want to talk about first is how I'm Not There is. It's almost like a synthesis of all your previous films. We see so many different strands of your work that come together here. We have the TV reporting that's also part of Poison, the black and white juxtaposed with the color photography, the narrative, the music, life of a famous star, the use of actors that we now recognize have been in a lot of different films of yours. Did you consciously think of it as something that was trying to pull together all these different influences that that you've been working on and that have been part of your work, or is it something that just sort of organically happened?
No, it wasn't really a motivating drive in conceptualizing the film or putting it together. And this is one of the sort of slightly more goofy passages in the movie, which I enjoy and which has a humor to it, which I think is sort of necessary. Because again, if the other films have been about evocations of artifice and its and its sort of secret, surprising depth and revelation of feeling. This is about the construction of authenticity, you know, and Bob Dylan, particularly this part of Bob Dylan's story, is about this fascinating, blind fervor to construct the authentic, you know, which defines American culture in so many ways, particularly at this time, coming out of the 1950s and sort of, you know, coalescing in the early 60s. No, I think that's also liberating when you take on a subject who's so canonized like Bob Dylan, to look at the ways he absolutely constructed himself, played into the hunger for truth and meaning and depth that was prevalent at that time in the sort of post-war period. But then through the success of those constructions and the intense desire for going back to them that his fans demanded, he had to kill them off sequentially. So it was a complete and total attack on all of these identities that he had created so well. And in many ways, I think it was like a survival mechanism for an intensely creative person who needed to somehow preserve some cavity of safety so the creative process could continue under the unbelievable cultural demands and expectations that each version of himself perpetuated. But what that meant is that you actually have somebody who we think of as the most sort of truthful, honest, authentic artist being a series of charades, all of them absolutely and totally felt at the time, but sort of burned through, you know, and necessarily turned to ash each time around. And he plays with that. I mean, I remember going to a Bob Dylan concert and then when we were researching I'm Not There, and the announcer who comes on is like, and now coming up, the Columbia recording artist Bob Dylan, who galvanized the folk scene in the early 1960s by telling us the truth and following the footsteps of Woody Guthrie, and then turned it on its head by plugging an electric in Newport in 1966, only to surprise us later by, falling in love with Jesus in the 80s, And this is the way he's introduced on stage today. Like, he enjoys this separation from himself just enough to be able to play with and allow for the cultural obsessions that fixate onto these various selves. Yeah,
it's his own construction of.
It's extraordinary and it's amazing but yeah, that was the project, and so it really wasn't about my own. It wasn't a culmination of my own references as a filmmaker. If anything, and it was an example, like other films of mine, to concentrate on the visual and stylistic references and experimentations of the 1960s, which were so rich, and which Dylan, I think, relied on or are essential to what he ended up doing at the time. He was literate and engaged, and he was a sponge to the cultural influences, even in film, that were happening. And so it was a great pleasure to quote so many Godard and Fellini and so many of the cinematic players of the time that made Bob Dylan who he was.
One of the reasons that I chose this clip was because of the actors. We get a good group here in a very short space of time. Some of them that we've already seen in previous clips. Could you talk a little bit about how you approach acting, especially for someone whose first medium-length feature was made with Barbie dolls?
Oh, you pick great people, and I've just been so incredibly lucky. I mean, and what I realized as I was watching some of the clips tonight, just how much different actors I've worked with. That's sort of what's wonderful about actors, is they really want to be challenged. The best ones want to be challenged. And so they will go to challenging directors. And that's how my films get made to a large degree, is because I get actors who want to be challenged, who want to be in my films. And I just remember how deeply some of these actors got into the roles that they played, like in Velvet Goldmine, where almost all of the actors were entertaining those characters in their lives in the most profound ways. And similarly, even in the short bits that happened in I'm Not There, like Heath Ledger was just so passionate and thorough about the way that he immersed himself in that character and in the whole, and also in I think what's nice about a lot of the actors I've worked with is they're inspired by the whole work and the whole sensibility and the whole sort of experiment that each of these films really were, and that's what they get off on. Like it's their character, but they get off on the whole risk that the entire enterprise is undertaking. So Heath was like into looking at the dailies. He kept going into the camera truck every day that he was on set, and looking at dailies of all the other stories that we had shot of all the other actors. And he really wanted to see a rough cut of the film, and I sent one to him, and he called me up and he asked me if he could show it to Terry Gilliam, who he is just starting to work with on the
Imaginarium, Dr.
Parnassus.
Yeah.
So that's just, I just miss him. I've been really, really lucky, and Julianne is just, and she and Christian could not keep a straight face when they were shooting those stills of themselves where she had the long dark wig. I mean, I only had like 2 shots of her where her face was not bursting into laughter. It was like, you guys, just pull it together for a second. Come on, man. But she cracked me up so much when she was doing her scenes, her interview scenes, that I had to go into the other room and shut the door because I kept distracting her because I was just laughing too hard while she was doing her stuff. So I'm been extraordinarily lucky, and of course Kate Blanchett and what she did in Dylan in her Jude transformation, and
she can do anything.
Anything. And what I just finished doing with Kate Winslet, where I can't imagine having undergone what we did in the time we had for shooting all of Mildred Pierce in basically the allotted time that you would shoot a single feature film. We had to do the equivalent of 3 feature films.
Yeah, you did 6 hours or something.
Yeah,
like that?
5.5 hours.
Yeah.
And without her total and complete commitment, conviction, and investment in what, not just the character, but the overall storytelling and how it was being told, that film. And her spirit. I mean, I think I just haven't ever had a really obnoxious actor on my films. Yeah, you hear these stories, and I've been extremely lucky. So I owe so much to them. I owe so much to how, when the films work, it's so often due to their performances, but I owe it to their commitment to the films to get them made to begin with.
Let's talk a little bit about Mildred Pierce, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some questions. One of the interesting things about that project, I think, I mean, when I first heard about it, I thought, okay, well, this totally makes sense. I mean, who else is going to direct this? But at the same time, I mean, there are a lot of things that you hadn't done. I mean, it's TV, it's a 6-hour thing, it's an adaptation.
Yeah.
So what was it that attracted you in the proposition? I mean, when it was made. This is more of a commission, I guess, than...
No, it wasn't. It was something, I read the book. I'd never read the book. I admire the film, but it's never been one of my favorite films, never really got under my skin, the Curtiz original film with Joan Crawford. But I knew it very well. John Raymond, who co-wrote the script with me, who's a dear friend in Portland, he said, you got to read the book to James M. Cain. He'd never seen the film version. Finally, I got around to reading the book of Mildred Pierce, and it was just as the financial markets were starting to teeter in the United States in 2008, the summer of 2008. And I'm reading this book that's so much more of an economic story. About the Depression years than the movie ever leads you to believe. It felt so intensely relevant. It spans the 10 years of the 30s, which you couldn't read more about in the references to the economic situation. And I thought, wow, this would be so... Christine had already mentioned to me, she'd been looking for financing sources for some of her features outside of feature filmmaking, had gone to cable and said, you know, Todd, you should think about doing a long-form piece for cable television. I think there'd be interest in your work. And if anything, you know, appealed to you that would sustain a longer experience like that, sustain multi-part drama, I think you could do it, you know? And so I was like, yeah, that's cool. I don't know what it would be exactly. And I read this, and given what was happening, I was like, wow, this would be the thing to do now. But do it in a way, like I realized I was very much aware, and so I thought the perfect place to do it would be HBO. They have the biggest budgets, and there's a solid company from what I've heard. And I couldn't get Kate Winslet out of my head when I was reading the book. So it was something we brought to HBO. They had a full slate for 2010 when we came in 2009, and we were like, and they squeezed us in, and they gave us whatever. It was not actually a very huge budget for TV at all, but they eked out what they could, and we went for it, and we grabbed the time to do it, to shoot it in 2010. But they were already moving away from doing fictional adaptations. Like their miniseries division was doing historical stuff like John Adams, and that was really becoming their bread and butter. So I didn't even know if they would be up for something that was based on a novel. But they really liked the approach, the idea. I said it really wasn't going to be something like Far From Heaven. I wanted to do something quite different, much more of a kind of new naturalism approach, inspired by 70s filmmaking, that would relate to what I was very aware of as being quite a different audience for me in my films. This is going to be an audience that wouldn't necessarily know my work, who'd turn on the TV and watch
Kate Winslet.
Let's watch that Kate Winslet thing tonight, you know? And I liked that. I thought that was really an opportunity to actually speak to different people about really relevant economic and social stuff. It's so intensely about class, the book, which is rare for American stories, and I thought that was an important thing to try to bring to an American audience.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We have some time for questions. I'm not sure how much time we have. So anyone who has a question, who has the microphone? You have the microphone, just raise your hand, get the microphone, and ask away. Yeah, there we go.
Hello.
Hi.
I'd like to ask about your cooperation with Christine Vachon. I know that she's been a major influence and help in the beginning. So if you can maybe speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, Christine has been a major help and influence all along in my career. Unfortunately, so much of what she's had to deal with on so many of these films is the economic situations of getting the financing for these films, which are always way less than they really need. And so she is a dragon slayer, basically. I mean, she's somebody who is fighting the big battles outside the door of the house that we're trying to build, of the films themselves. And, and so we start together. During the process of filmmaking, we end up in very different places doing our work simultaneously, knowing that the other person is keeping the roof over each other's head. And then we come together in the end. I mean, it's never adversarial between us because she's there to support the films and do anything she possibly can to keep them going. And we've had some really shaky, rough turns, particularly on Far From Heaven. And I'm Not There. Oh my God, they were incredibly fraught productions. Finally, on Mildred Pierce, it was like we worked with a studio. It was such a wonderful thing to be able to work with a solid group of people who are smart, literate, who wanted something complicated and demanding, and we didn't have to raise the money. And so she got to be there for the creative process again. With Poison, where we started, she was the AD. She looked at all the dailies with me. It was a creative partnership in ways that it didn't always get to be on subsequent projects. But it was so great to have that sort of come full circle on Far From Heaven and on Mildred Pierce, and have her be back like kind of at my side, enjoying the creative process of the filmmaking, which was so nice. I know it was great for her. But we've remained incredibly close friends through this whole process, and yeah, it's really hard to imagine my career, my films without her.
Okay, there was another question in the back somewhere. Please raise your hand again, yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So I have a question about the type of, you were talking about universal communication after watching the clip of Far From Heaven. Is there any form derived from art or music or culture that helps you tune into this like universal communication that you were bringing up before, that you said the mother and her daughter both tuned into? And yeah, I was just curious about that, because the way you worded it was really nice. And if maybe you could speak about that, that would be cool.
I think, I think it's sort of stuff I've been talking about probably a lot already, which is, and a lot of it is not just film, because I think it can happen in film with people like Hitchcock in the purest, most magnificent way, in the universal way in that it reaches the mass of people, but it also challenges, ideas of social normalcy in the process, and it ties it all up with a bow. There's something crazy about how perfectly that works. But I think music is the thing that's about as universal as you can get, because it doesn't even have to be comprehended. Like, the thing about Dylan is it's all those words, but I think John Lennon said, like, you don't have to understand a single word that Dylan sings to know what he's talking about. And music has to work at that purely visceral level. And film is a linear, sensual experience that has to function very much like music, non-intellectually, non-rhetorically. It has to work at a core level, viscerally, visually. It's a visual medium. I'm sure all you guys who've been studying this medium from all the different capacities and all the different departments that you are in, that's really what you're learning, is how to make that work in the sort of most intuitive way, and making use of the plastic possibilities of cinema to work very much like music does, in a non-intellectual way, to tell your stories. Like Sternberg, I think, said you can turn his films upside down and watch them on the screen and understand what they're about, because they communicate in that pure, immediate way.
Okay, any more questions? Don't be shy. We're far away here in the front. Yep, in the very back there. Just a second, the microphone's coming.
I've really enjoyed seeing the growth in your work as far as the language, and one thing that I'm curious about in transitioning from New York to Portland, which I go up to Portland about 4 times a year whenever I go to write, because I find it a very, I don't know, it's a magical city in a certain way. I'm curious, a choice of Portland from New York City is very interesting. What was it about Portland versus, you've got on the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and in turn, what has that done for you creatively, and also in your career?
I think it is a magical place. I totally know what you mean in terms of needing it as sort of an antithesis to the big city experience. And I think, I wouldn't have traded the years I was in New York for anything, and I don't think I would have become the person I am without them. And a lot of it does have to do with a kind of weird ambition. And although the city was a messier, crazier, scarier place when I first moved there than it is today, where money seems to determine so much of what the real estate is like and the visual experience is like and what the sort of discourse is like in New York, or at least where I, travel. I think you have to go out of the city further and further to get to younger people who are experimenting with their work into Brooklyn and Queens and out of the city to find that. But I found something in Portland, and of course every place is changing all the time, and Portland has changed a great deal in the 10 years that I've lived there, and those 10 years have flown by. But I felt liberated by the fact that there was creative people, literate people, politically engaged and active people who didn't need or want to be in a power center, who actually wanted to be with each other more than they necessarily wanted to be, and making work that their friends would see, and that was as important as getting something produced by a studio or getting the big position at a firm or whatever it might be. That I dug about it, and I felt that there was also a kind of sense of humor about life. There was a little bit more playfulness in this place. I think because it isn't the competitive urban, place or ex-urban like Los Angeles place that it is. It was almost skipped over in the development of other West Coast cities like Seattle and San Francisco, and so it's been able to come onto its own more recently. More of it has been preserved. There's more surprising relics of old weirdness in Portland that you might find in other cities around it. But mostly I really love the people I met, and I met writers, musicians, artists, performance artists, a lot of people doing music and stuff like that, and that, or people who had made their careers elsewhere and then decided to settle there, So for all of that, it's been really nurturing. And there are times I was just in New York for a year and a half making Mildred Pierce. All my friends were like, "So, what do you think? Gonna come back? Come on." And I have some of my dearest, oldest friends in New York, but I don't miss the cityness of life there. I'm spoiled by the ease and the quiet and the sort of improvisational aspects of Portland. That's until I visited Prague.
Okay, I have one last question and then we'll wrap this up. What would be the one piece of advice for budding filmmakers or screenwriters that are in the room here, that you could give them, something that no one told you when you started that would have been very useful?
I wish I could think of a really smart John Waters-y thing to say, but they never come to you. They only come to him. Really, I say the same thing, which is just, and you guys know this, especially given what I've heard about this school and how hard it is to get into it, and is make your work. Just make it, like any way possible. Now there are more ways to do that through digital options, and but until you have gotten your hands and feet and face wet in the process, that's how you learn what you want to do, what you care about saying, and that's how you show other people what that looks like. Then you have something to show, then you can take it around and take it to festivals and take it to studios or wherever that leads you. But it's all about just making it. And there's a lot of people now who really want to, there's so many modes of expression, more than ever, proliferation of ways of doing things, but there isn't, unfortunately, I feel like there's a lack of why we're doing it and what we're doing. There's a lack of interpretive, critical drive. The world is confusing, and we've splintered it up into sound bites and into shuffle modes and into a sort of discontinuous language. And discontinuity can be stimulating and important, but it's also, we have to remember how to put the ideas together and communicate with each other. So that's what you learn by making stuff, because you learn how to communicate to each other. So that's the best thing I can say.
Okay, well, thank you, Todd Haynes.
Thanks, you guys. Thanks for coming.
And thank you for communicating with us, and thanks to both of you for this very erudite and illuminating masterclass. And I hope you were being truthful when you said that you like Prague and that we see you here again soon.